The Extremis Publishing podcast is endorsed by Heart 200, Scotland's most exciting road trip. Find out more at heart200.scot.
Hello and welcome to the Extremis Publishing podcast. I'm Tom Christie. Welcome to our Halloween special of the podcast, where we're going to be talking a little bit about the traditions of Halloween, how far back they go, and also how they relate to the culture of Scotland. And joining me today, I'm delighted to say, is our friend Robert Murray, who's the author of, amongst other things, the Grocer's Boy series and The Spirit of Robbie Burns.
Good afternoon, Tom. It's a pleasure to be with you again, having a chat about things that we enjoy chatting about.
Well, Robbie, you're someone who has studied Scottish culture and history for many years, so I've really been delighted to have this opportunity to have a chat with you about Halloween. While it's become common to have Halloween celebrations right across the world in many different areas, people might be surprised to know that its origins, certainly its modern origins, are actually Scottish in nature. So how far back do Halloween activities go?
Quite a long way, Tom. It's amazing when you start to delve into the history of Halloween, that it goes way back into the BCs. In fact, not so long ago, I was just reading that in the 5th century BC, the Celtics were well known for introducing what we today call Halloween, but of course it wouldn't be called that in those days. They were observing festivals, and there's one festival in particular it's pronounced Samhain, but it's spelt something quite different. It's spelt Samhain, Samhain. But the Samhain festival was obviously something that all these years ago was being exercised, practiced by the Celts. Of course, that would be true of the whole of Scotland and Ireland, I think, basically. And of course, it was celebrating the end of what would be the summer period and celebrating the start of the winter period. And strange enough, that comes halfway between the solstice and the equinox. So there are some forces at work there, but fundamentally, I guess, the growing period, the sunshine warmed growing period, and the celebration of all the fruits of the labours of the fields and fruit trees, and the forthcoming winter would be a time to take stock of all of that. So that, I guess, would be the origins a long time ago of something that, strangely enough, here we are, many centuries later, still celebrating in small part some of those early practices. So at the end of October, it was the time when the ghosts and the demons were roaming the earth, moving around. And of course, it's paganism in the sense that these evil forces had to be dealt with in some form. But that's the first recognition that there were evil forces going back all these years. I think moving a little bit further on, about the 1st century, of course the Romans arrived on our shores, and the Romans adopted the Samhain, the Samhain practices, and of course they brought with them their own ideals and beliefs. And of course, when you stop to think, there would be practices around the world in the dense jungles of anywhere in the world where there are, even today, practices going on where the indigenous people will have their own fears of how to deal with the dead spirits coming back. I remember seeing something in the Amazon jungle somewhere where all the old figures of the village were being remembered as the dead, and people were celebrating these lives of people moved on. So I guess every element of human behaviour somewhere along the line likes to reflect on that. But here's the Romans arriving, and interestingly enough, they pick up on the practices. And funnily enough, I was just reading about the fact that the Romans brought with them the goddess of the harvest was a lady by the name of Pomona. And Pomona, of course, is apples. And that, I think, is the earliest sign of apples having anything to do with Halloween. Of course, they didn't call it Halloween in those days. But presumably, that would be, apples would represent the harvest or part of the harvest. And here are the Romans practicing celebrating apples, and we can go on and talk about what happened to the apples later on, but that was the introduction of apples in the whole scenario of this celebration by the Romans in our land here. And then it goes on into, strangely enough, all these practices would be seen by us now as pagan, but interestingly enough, in the 7th century, a certain pope began to establish certain days in the year that were designated in the religious calendar. And this is the first reference we've got where some of these practices are given names, and one of them was All Saints' Day, where they were honouring the martyrs of in the religious world. So we're moving forward from old practices, pre-Roman, and now we're coming into a religious influence coming from Pope Boniface, I think, was the gentleman. We move further forward into where we get more religious connections coming into the 11th century, where in November we've got a day designated as All Souls Day. And of course that becomes eventually All Saints and All Souls Day. Hence the word eventually, as it was All Hallowtide, eventually it became the evening of Hallowtide, which became Halloween, the evening of Halloween. Now this is a gentle process that was going on for hundreds of years. Of course, we as children took part in Halloween activities with no idea what we were doing. We were in total ignorance of what practice what we were following. But strange enough, we're in the history books because we were part of the practice. And then we move into another period where things change slightly. I suppose, to some extent, we're now dealing with people who have got some degree of learning, some degree of ability to read and write. We're moving into now the 18th century, and as it happens, that's the time when our Scottish bard Robert Burns was born and lived, and he wrote about Halloween. He's got influences of Halloween in at least two parts that I've read. But that, I think, is where the 18th century part begins to develop, because that was a holiday called Hallow Evening, and it first becomes Halloween. Burns wrote about that. We can perhaps touch on some of the things that were going on in Scotland at that point in time. But if we move further, there was an amazing development, because, as we know, there was a huge movement from the Highland clearances in Scotland to what we now call the Commonwealth countries. There was also the mass exodus of Irish people across the Atlantic. Both of these movements for different reasons, took the people and their customs worldwide. And the 19th century, because travel permitted the journeying from Scotland or Ireland to practically by sail to any part of the world, and with it the customs of Halloween were transferred as well. And so, we come to the 20th century where it becomes in the United States a popular holiday, a designated holiday, and quite a time for celebrating, if that's the word. And here we are in the 21st century. Halloween has become a worldwide multi-billion industry, probably for obviously economic expedient ideas of somebody somewhere wants to make money, but the ingredients are still there. So that's a potted history, Tom, of how I've picked up on the origins. So yes, Scotland very firmly is at the root of this worldwide practice that we now, although perhaps different in its form, is still being practiced.
Well, taking a step back to those early Halloween events, they would have been quite different from the celebrations that we have now. How would you say an early Scottish Halloween would have been celebrated?
Well, I think it's picked up in Burns' poem, which is called Halloween, and it's also easy enough to pick up in all the things that we read about Halloween. But obviously a bonfire is a key element. Bonfires seem to be practiced in the 18th century. I'm not quite sure if the bonfire was existing before that. In its semi-religious context earlier, I don't think there was any word of bonfires, but bonfires seem to be introduced at a later stage. So certainly in the Scottish context, a bonfire was an ingredient of the... And then, of course, there comes the neep lantern, or should I say turnip lantern. And we, as boys and girls, we scooped out turnips. And in my early days, having holidayed on a small farm, it was a great excitement to carve out the turnip, and turnips were in ample supply. And of course the turnip has a meaning. It's carved out with the ugly face of a witch or a warlock, and the meaning of this is that is to stave off the evil spirits. That's an attempt to scare the evil spirits and to protect us from the evil spirits. And I just came across a small piece of information recently about the candle in the turnip, and of course we'd no idea what we were doing, but evidently the light inside the candle represents the burning flame of a trapped spirit trying to get out. It's trapped in a spirit. So we'd no idea what we were doing. We just happily carved out our turnips and off we went. Apple duking, I've touched on the word apple introduced by the Romans. The apple duking is an extra practice. Again, what does it mean? Why are we doing? Well, I suppose the apples were introduced by the Romans as a thing to play with, but as the years rolled on, I think people tried to put a meaning on what are we doing with these apples. And I think the first person to duke or duck down to the bottom of the basin and come up with an apple is the person that's designated to be the next person to be married in the village. Now, I don't know if two people came up with the same apple or came up with an apple each at the same time. There may have been a connotation that they were going to be husband and wife at some time. I think all sorts of crazy little ideas may have been attached to the apples. Then treacle scones. I personally have never actually had the pleasure of dealing with a treacle scone, but treacle scones were hanging on strings, and the idea was to try and take a bite, and again, maybe the person that had finished eating the treacle scone entirely might have been the first person to be married, or again, there may be a link with some boy and girlfriend, who knows. the mind boggles as to how the treacle scone managed to stay in one piece when only a tiny crumb was left on the end of the string, but that's another question. Then nut roasting. Strangely enough, I've always associated nut roasting with England. In my travels in England during the 60s, 70s and 80s, I've seen the practice of chestnut roasting, and I think in Dickens' time and various other writers have touched on the subject of chestnut roasting. I didn't actually associate chestnut roasting in my own Scottish context, but I've subsequently managed to read Burns did, in his Halloween poem, touch on the roasting. And here again, I suppose human nature tried to invent some meaning in whatever apples or treacle scones were being consumed. But I think, again, the understanding I have is if a chestnut crackles and fires off its hot bed of roasting pot and lands on a lady's lap, then this is another signal that this may be somebody's future partner for life. Again, who knows how many little stories have been invented. So the nut roasting is part of this. Then we've got to think of guising. I went guising with my pals. Boys only. We didn't go with girls. We went with just boys. We went from our part of the town, and not surprisingly, we chose what we thought were the well-off parts of the town. A, because we thought we'd get some better rewards for our efforts, and equally that somebody might have even been interested enough to listen to what we had to say. But we did in my time, and I'm talking about the 1950s, we would leave home dressed up in outfits, ghoulish type of outfits, with masks, carrying our neat lantern, and of course what we were really doing, although we were probably unaware of it at the time, we were trying to scare off the evil spirits. So we had to look quite evil ourselves. And off we would go, and we did learn a poem, we did learn a song, and sometimes we would tell a joke. And we did get excellent responses from the rich people in the part of the town that we inflicted our Halloween practices. And we did get some nice money in our can. And we did not squander it, and we did use it for the purposes that I think were intended, which for us was that we were able to then finance our fireworks for the bonfire. In those days we were talking about a Guy Fawkes bonfire. The bonfire we were referring to was related to what we thought was the 5th of November. But here again, there lies the question, did the bonfire practice precede Mr. Fawkes? We don't know. I'm just asking a question rather than making a statement there. So guising was good fun, and of course, because we were dressed up in weird clothes and masks, we could probably walk up Calogie Road and nobody would know, oh, there's the boy that sang that song, because we were incognito. That was one of the pluses. But another practice, and this is something I think I've touched upon this, but again, Burns's poem called Halloween refers to the practice of kale pulling. Kale is a form of a cabbage, or that form, a Savoy or cabbage, a kale, usually used for human consumption, but I think in later years became a cheaper form of animal fodder for wintertime feeding. But there was a kale pulling practice where the kale had either been picked and we were left with the stalk of the kale still stuck in the ground, still rooted in the ground. And the practice in Burns' time was to pick out these kale sticks, and it's a bit like a chestnut game, trying to smash somebody else's chestnut. This was a practice of trying to see who had the strongest kale stalk. And again, what connotation we can put on whose kale stalk bent first, what did it mean? I have no idea, but that was another practice. Somebody perhaps can put some more light on that subject. So those are the main elements, they may not have all happened in the 18th century onwards, but certainly in Burns' time, most of these were happening. And I came across an interesting thing the other day. Again, 18th century, but I'm not quite sure why this has been created. But there was an Act of Parliament called the Witchcraft Act of 1735, which forbade eating pork as a pastime or with any pastries at Halloween. Why would that be, Tom? I'm not quite sure. Why would you be forbidden to eat pork in a pastry at Halloween? Would it be a religious element, or would it be something to do with the fact that you wouldn't want to be seen to be using up valuable food source? I'm not sure. But anyway, unbelievably, that act was not repealed until the 1950s. So nobody told me when I was guising I shouldn't have been putting, my mum could have afforded it, that I shouldn't have been putting pork in my Halloween pastry. But it's an interesting piece of legislation. So it was an active celebration, Halloween, and of course the religious element had gone out of it. And today, although Pope Boniface, way back in the 7th century, had some connection with All Saints' Days and loosely connected with Halloween and the origins of the Celts. Although all that happened, we've now arrived at the days since the 18th century where the practices are being criticised largely by the church. They're seen as more pagan and therefore have no part in the church practices today. So it's a strange turnabout of events in an odd way. But yes, Tom, that's about as much as I can say. Happily, I've thoroughly enjoyed most of these practices I've accounted to, and all happy, good fun.
Now, it goes without saying, and you've touched on his name already, that the one person who played a pivotal role in popularising Halloween was none other than Scotland's national bard, Robert Burns. How did works such as Tam O'Shanter help to establish Halloween in the cultural mindset of the time?
It's interesting, Tom, because Burns and all the material he wrote was so readily read and consumed by the population, a population that was barely literate. There was some reading and writing because of all the countries in this part of the world, Scotland was leading the way in its very elementary education of its young people. Villages all over Scotland would have a man who was the leading clergy minister of the church, who would in many cases be the only learned person in the village, and he would be what we call in Scotland the domine, a teacher. And because of that learning of local people, Burns's works were readily available to be read about and to be read. And so when Burns came to write anything, it was immediately grasped as a reflection of the work and the life of the poverty-stricken people in Scotland. And there was a huge divide between the very rich and the very poor. Burns hit a note of understanding the poor lifestyle of his fellow man, and so when he wrote Tam O'Shanter, as an example, included in that tale of Tam O'Shanter, the man riding home to the shanter where he lived. He's too late. He's been drinking alcohol. He's left it far too late at night. He's dashing home, and he knows his wife will be extremely angry, to say the least, and he's aware of all of her feelings. And as he sets off on his horse, through the combination of his alcohol and his fevered brain about what trouble he's going to get into, his mind wanders into all the dark, ghoulish, warlike weird things in life. Somewhere along the line, Burns, who knew his mythology and knew his history of Halloween, he would be well versed in understanding all of these things. Burns has very cleverly incorporated in his poem of Tam O'Shanter this fearful force that Tam is faced with. So, riding home in pitch dark with a touch of moon, and he's seeing the silhouettes of the church buildings as he rides through the town. He's aware that the witches could cast an evil spell on him, and one of the things he's well aware of is that he knows if he can cross water, he'll be free from the agony of being captured by the witches and warlocks. And so Burns very cleverly writes this into the poem, and true enough, Tam does ride across the Brig of Ayr and across the water, and at last he's saved, except Burns invents the story that the horse's tail has disappeared, but that was the close shave with the warlocks. So it's interesting that what it was all about was Burns was understanding the influence of these dark forces. And when you think about it, the reason that we were talking earlier on and discussing guising, the forces were evil forces. They weren't forces where the dead were coming back in a loving nature. The concept was that the evil forces were coming back to scout around the land, and therefore that's why guising became important, because we were dressing up as an evil being ourselves to ward off the evil spirits. So Burns very cleverly wove that into his Tam O'Shanter poem. And of course Burns also wrote a Halloween poem which describes the antics of the young people with a bonfire. We've touched on various elements, the kale sticks, the bonfire. Burns represented all of that in his poem, and it's an interesting poem to read. And I would thoroughly recommend that if someone can access the Halloween poem, is to get it translated into its English meaning, and that's well worth doing, because it casts a clear light on what Burns understood. Burns himself, as a boy, probably practiced the bonfires, the nut burning and the guising and the turnip lanterns. He would do all that himself. So he's introduced that, and so yes, he reflected that in his work. There are two excellent pieces where Burns has done that.
It's often said that it was really the 19th century, when there was a very large number of Scottish immigrants to North America, that saw Halloween start to become more of a global tradition. Do you think that's an accurate way of putting things?
I think it's accurate, Tom. Without going into too many reasons about why the Scottish and Irish people, for that matter, but I can only talk about the Scottish element. The poverty and the inequality and the bitterness that existed between the very rich and the very poor in Scotland, bearing in mind the population of Scotland in the 18th century was probably somewhere around 1.5 million. Out of that, there were probably only 20,000 very rich family members, very extremely rich landowners spread across the country. I'm not quite sure of the figures there, but it's of that proportion. The vast majority of people were poverty in its greatest sense. I can give examples where, for example, in a prison in Kilmarnock in Ayrshire, which is just several miles away from Burns' where he was born and brought up. The prison there in the 18th century, as an example, written by a statistical account written by the local parish minister, indicated that in the prison there were something like 60 vagrants locked up because they were a scourge on the countryside, 50 or 60 debtors, people who were down and they'd failed to pay their dues and were locked up because they were a debtor. There were women with children women with no husband but with illegitimate children in the prison. And of course, to cap it all, there would be a few people of real criminals who were robbers. But the point they're making is that the vast majority of numbers, and this was typical of what I've read in a place like Kilmarnock, that this vast number of people were so downtrodden, and that was a terrible indictment of the way the country was run, because only the very rich were running it for the very rich. And so there were, in fact, cases, well-documented cases, where landowners brought sheep onto their land, tried to clear all the highland areas, get rid of the people because it was a more economic pastime or economic practice to, rather than pick up rents, poverty, little paltry rents, and bring on sheep. But there's also other stories where the landed gentry not only did that, but prevented some of their crofters from even trying to escape Scotland. And I know of one case in the very north of Scotland, in the Caithness area, where the Scottish people were being prevented. They wanted to go to Canada, and they were being prevented. Such was the power of the landowning class at that point. Burns had a lot to say about that, was highly critical. And if anybody wanted to read up, there was an address to Beelzebub, Beelzebub, Beelzebub. Burns was highly critical of this practice of trying to prevent people going abroad. And this indicates this was the practice. I think it would be potato famine in the case of the Irish, and it was certainly in the case of the landowning classes in Scotland, where people were fleeing from abject poverty, no place in society, and they would take with them all these practices that I explained earlier, the 18th century practices. They were very much part of their psyche, very much part of their normal living elements of life. So yes, I can well understand why United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, these places, Scottish people fled to a better life, a fairer life, and where there was some value, where they were valued, and there would be some reward for their labours. But that's what they were not getting in Scotland. So yes, they would take all these practices with them, and I would not be surprised that they would continue exactly as they had been doing in Scotland.
Now, if we think about influences on the modern Halloween, I mean, you have a lot of influences like, the Hammer horror films, the Universal horror films, old Vincent Price movies, things like that. What do you think that Scots of yesteryear would make of today's Halloween traditions? I mean, do you think they would have felt more at home with guising or, say, trick-or-treating than they would have done with all of the macabre horror conventions that we have come to associate with the season now?
I don't know, Tom. It's a tricky one. If I give my own example, I did all my guising and turned up lantern singing and giving poems at somebody's doorstep. We weren't invited in, by the way. we had to perform on the doorstep, and I think maybe on a rare occasion, somebody may, on a very wild, snowy night, we may have actually been invited in. But the issue of that trick and treating has become modernised. Trick and treating was not a term we used, but I can understand the term in the United States of America. Trick and treating, it's fundamentally the same thing. And incidentally, the root of the trick and treating is that what was being offered originally, way back in centuries before, was that the original statement was to try and say something that would wave off any evil spirits. But the reason for giving a presentation of a song or a poem was really born out of the idea that we were actually saying a prayer for the dead. That was the origin. It was a prayer of thanksgiving for the dead. And if the deal was, if we like to put it this way, the underlying concept was that if we gave a song or a poem, it was for the soul of the dead. That was actually trying to say something on behalf of the soul of the dead. And in exchange for that came the treat. So the word trick is not exactly right, but if the trick was to actually give a poem or sing a song, that the root of that was actually giving something in memory of the souls of the dead. And if you did that to a family, the family were going to reward you with a sweetie or a biscuit or money. So I think the modern practices have been commercialised. I think that's the safest thing. We've got mass productions of masks. We've got costumes. We've got the publicity that can go around the world on television, and the publicity of how different countries are doing this is now quite well known. So I think it's been watered down. And I have to say, in the 1950s, I had no idea what the root was, the root of my practices, and all the history and the meaning of what was lying behind all our tricking and treating. But today, I think equally, in today's 21st century, the young people will be equally, as I was, ignorant of the practices. But it's been multiplied and commercialised, and now it's become a bit of fun. In fact, we hear today stories that the youngsters stand at the door and nobody's even primed them to say a song or say a poem, and yet they expect a sweetie or some money. So youngsters today probably don't perform. We did. I'm happy to say we did sing our song or give a poem, but the youngsters today, I don't think, do so. I think on the surface they see the idea of just it's a means of dressing up, and it's an excuse to ask for money.
And one final question. Now that Halloween has become such big business, enjoyed by people all over the world, what do you think are the key elements from the festival's formative days that have survived most prominently over the centuries?
I think there's probably three. The masks are still being used. The ducking for apples still being used, and the idea of a trick and treat is there, but it's only there in part. It's there looking for the treat without the trick, and I think that's where the young ones probably miss out. But turnips, well, you see, you can buy some form of lantern, a paper lantern with a battery in a trick shop, and there's no need to carve out a turnip. But so there will be lanterns, paper lanterns. So masks, lanterns, a costume, not perhaps nearly as ghoulish and garish as what we did, but there'll still be masks, there'll still be costumes, there will be apples, and there will be treats. And the only thing that's missing, sadly, is the trick.
Well, Robbie, as we sit here by our bonfire, amongst the cobwebs with our jack-o'-lantern, all that remains is for me to wish you a very happy Halloween.
Thanks, Tom. I think I'll put on a different mask this year, Tom. And I may, just to confound my neighbours, I might just actually dream up a poem. I'm joking. I'd really like to go and try and do that myself. It would be quite good fun. But today, the world has changed so much that somebody turning up on your doorstep dressed with a ghoulish costume and a ghoulish mask, you'd probably see a blue light from the police car before you knew where you were. So sadly, I think that's where we are today. Anyway, it's been a pleasure chatting with you, Tom.
Always a pleasure to talk to you, Robbie, and thanks so much for having joined us today. Thanks so much for having tuned in, and I hope that you'll join us again soon.
If you would like to find out more about advertising on the Extremis Publishing podcast, please visit their website at www.extremispublishing.com for details.